The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed, a sickly, sterile sound that scraped against the raw nerves stretched taut inside my skull. Every breath was a tight knot in my chest. Across the aisle, he sat, handsome, composed, a predator in a perfectly tailored suit, watching me with the same cool, dismissive gaze he'd worn for months. The air felt thick, charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. The bailiff called the room to order, a dry, official sound cutting through the tension. The judge, a woman with kind eyes that somehow still managed to hold the weight of the world's grievances, cleared her throat. My lawyer, bless her stoic heart, placed a reassuring hand on my forearm, but I barely felt it. My entire universe had shrunk to the space between the judge's bench and my own beating heart. This was it. The end of everything I knew, or the beginning of something I couldn't yet comprehend. It all came down to her next words. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. It feels like another lifetime ago now, before the coldness set in, before the air turned thin and brittle, before the trust wasn't just broken, but shattered into a million irreparable pieces, each shard a painful memory. We had a life, a beautiful, sun-drenched, sprawling kind of life that felt solid, built on rock. Or so I thought. He was everything I'd ever wanted, or everything I'd convinced myself I wanted. Charming, ambitious, driven. He built his company from the ground up, a tech firm that soared, climbing the market like a vine, wrapping itself around success. Early days were lean, ramen and late nights, but we were together, dreaming. I was his partner, his rock, the one who listened to the endless pitches, ironed his shirts, believed implicitly in the vision. My own career, quieter, less demanding, took a back seat naturally. It wasn't a sacrifice, not then. It felt like part of the team, part of the dream. His success was our success. His growing wealth was our security, our future. We bought the house with a ridiculous view, drove the cars you only saw in magazines, lived a life curated from glossy pages. I managed the home, the social calendar, the soft side of our empire. It felt right, comfortable, safe. He worked harder than anyone I knew, long hours, travel, the constant hum of deals and deadlines. I understood. I supported. I was the quiet anchor in his storm of ambition. There was love, yes, or at least what I perceived as love. Affection, companionship, a shared history. We talked about the future, vague, sun-drenched visions of retirement, travel, ease. He handled the finances, the big picture stuff. It made sense. He was the business guru after all. I had my own accounts, my own small savings from my work, but the bulk of our wealth, the investments, the bills, the credit cards, they were all linked, all under his purview. His name was on the mortgage, most of the assets, but my name was on the joint accounts, the credit cards. It was our money, our life. It felt like a single, intertwined entity. We were a unit, indivisible, or so the story went. Looking back, maybe the signs were there, small fissures in the perfect facade. His increasing obsession with work, the way he'd sometimes snap when stressed, the emotional distance that sometimes felt like a chasm. But I dismissed them. Stress. Success. The price you pay for building an empire. I poured my energy into making our home a sanctuary, a place of peace amidst the chaos of his professional life. I entertained clients, played the supportive wife, smiled for the cameras at corporate events. I believed in the dream, in him. Utterly. Completely. Foolishly. The foundation felt solid. Unshakable. Until the day the bank called. It wasn't a dramatic movie moment, no police tape or flashing lights. Just a polite, confused voice on the phone asking about a rejected payment. A payment for something small, routine. I brushed it off, thinking it was a simple glitch. But then another call came. And another. Calls from different banks, different accounts. My accounts. Accounts I rarely used for large purchases, preferring to consolidate things through the joint ones he managed. The polite confusion on the other end of the line began to morph into something else, something guarded and concerned. They mentioned limits, overdrafts, declined transactions. My breath hitched. This wasn't right. I logged into the online portals, my fingers fumbling on the keyboard, and the numbers swam before my eyes.
Red.
Everywhere. Maxed out. Every single credit card in my name, or in both our names but tied to my identity, was maxed out. Not just a little over the limit.
Drained.
Empty. Hundreds of thousands. Maybe more. The panic started as a small flutter in my chest, a trapped bird, then exploded outwards, a cold wave washing over me. This wasn't possible. We had money. He had money. His company was flying high. Where had it gone? And why was it all tied to my cards? I remember the feeling of the cold floor under my bare feet as I paced, phone still clutched in my hand, staring blankly at the computer screen filled with terrifying figures. My mind scrambled for an explanation. An error? Fraud? Had someone stolen our identity? I tried calling him. No answer. I called his office.
Busy.
I left messages, increasingly frantic. The silence on his end was a scream in my ears. Then the email arrived.
Short.
Clinical. From his lawyer. He was filing for divorce. Effective immediately. Citing irreconcilable differences. My stomach plummeted. The divorce filing alone would have been a seismic shock, a betrayal of every vow, every shared moment. But coupled with the financial ruin, the mountains of debt piled onto my name, it wasn't just divorce. It was annihilation. A calculated, precise strike designed to leave me with nothing. The days that followed were a blur of cold dread and frantic energy. The banks were relentless. Calls, letters, threats. The sheer scale of the debt was paralyzing. It felt like drowning in a sea of red ink. I couldn't understand it.
How? Why?
Where did the money go? And how could he do this? The man I had loved, supported, built a life with. He was systematically dismantling me, leaving me with nothing but debt and the wreckage of our life. I tried to get access to our joint accounts, the investment portfolios he managed. Locked out. Everything was locked out. He had moved fast, cutting me off completely, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. I felt stupid, naive. How had I not seen this? How had I trusted him so completely with everything? My own finances were modest, enough to live on simply, but nowhere near enough to tackle the crushing debt he had engineered. I needed a lawyer, desperately, but the good ones cost money. Money I suddenly didn't have. I scrambled, borrowing from a friend, scraping together every last cent I could find. The first few consultations were disheartening. Lawyers listened sympathetically, then their faces would fall as they looked at the numbers, the scale of the debt, the speed and ruthlessness of his moves. It's complicated, they'd say. He's anticipated everything, he's got significant resources, meaning I didn't. The system felt stacked against me. He had the high-powered legal team, the financial muscle, the advantage of having planned this betrayal meticulously. I had a mountain of debt and a shattered heart. The challenges multiplied. Every corner I turned, a new obstacle. He contested everything. Every penny I needed for living expenses, every attempt to gain information about the state of his finances or his company's assets. His lawyers painted a picture of me as extravagant, irresponsible, as if I was the one who had blown through millions on credit cards. They used the very debt he created as proof of my reckless spending. It was a grotesque distortion of reality, a cruel twist of a knife. Meanwhile, the pressure from creditors intensified. My credit score plummeted. My own small savings were dwindling, just paying for basic necessities and the initial legal fees. The house, the beautiful house I had made a home, suddenly felt alien, cold. It was in his name, he reminded me through his lawyers, and I was living there on borrowed time. The threat of being forced out loomed constantly. Friends, unsure of whose side to take or simply uncomfortable with the mess, drifted away. I was increasingly isolated, spending my days poring over confusing financial statements I barely understood, trying to piece together the timeline of his financial maneuvers, trying to find a pattern, a clue. But it was like trying to find a single thread in a tangled, poisoned web. He had woven it expertly. The sheer volume of transactions on those credit cards was overwhelming. Purchases I didn't recognize, massive cash advances, transfers to accounts I couldn't identify. It was clear this wasn't just frivolous spending. This was strategic. He was using my credit, my good name, to siphon money, or perhaps to create debt that would legally offset assets during the divorce, leaving me burdened and him relatively untouched. The depths of his betrayal felt like a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep properly. Every moment was consumed by the gnawing fear of losing everything, of being left destitute by the man I had loved. The crisis deepened. The lawyer I had managed to hire, a competent but busy woman, was struggling against his legal Goliath. Their motions were relentless, their arguments persuasive, backed by mountains of carefully constructed financial documentation that somehow made his position look reasonable and mine look like the ramblings of a bitter, spendthrift ex-wife. We lost motion after motion. The court granted him temporary control of more assets, citing the need to protect his business interests. My access to funds became even more restricted. The possibility of losing the house became a near certainty. The debt collectors became more aggressive, their calls tinged with threats. I felt trapped, cornered. There seemed to be no way out. Every avenue I explored led to a dead end. The law, designed to be impartial, seemed blind to the emotional reality of his calculated cruelty, focusing only on the cold financial facts he had so cleverly manipulated. My lawyer warned me that fighting this further would be ruinous, even if we somehow won a small victory. The legal fees would swallow any potential settlement. His offer, delivered with a sneer through his lawyer, was insulting. A pittance, barely enough to cover a fraction of the debt he'd put in my name, contingent on me signing away any claim to his company or significant assets. Accept it, my lawyer advised, cut your losses. But accepting it meant validating his actions, letting him get away with it, being buried alive under a mountain of debt he created. It meant letting him win completely. The thought was unbearable. I sat alone in the echoing silence of the almost empty house, surrounded by boxes I couldn't afford to move, staring at the terrifying numbers on the screen, feeling the last vestiges of hope drain away. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about justice. About standing up to someone who thought they could discard me after using me, leaving me to drown.
But how?
How could I fight back when I had nothing and he had everything? One rainy afternoon, sifting through years of dusty paperwork I had retrieved from the attic, old tax documents, scanned emails, business trip itineraries, a memory surfaced. A fleeting comment he had made years ago, back when the company was still finding its feet. Something about patents. About a key piece of technology, the core of his company's success, being developed early on. And something about how he had been so focused on getting the funding and getting the product out that he had done something with the paperwork. Something quick, maybe not entirely conventional, to secure the intellectual property fast. At the time, it sounded like typical startup hustle. Now, the memory pricked at something. What if not entirely conventional meant legally shaky? What if the foundation of his empire wasn't as solid as it appeared? I mentioned it to my lawyer, almost dismissively. He said something about the patents, maybe not doing the paperwork quite right in the beginning. She paused, her expression shifting. The patents. She pulled up the public records for his company. They looked solid. All filed correctly, years ago, but the seed was planted. What if the public record wasn't the whole story? I remembered helping him back then, in the chaotic early days, printing documents, sorting files, late nights fueled by coffee. I had scanned things for him. Box after box of receipts, contracts, legal documents. Where were those scans? I dug through old hard drives, backup disks, cloud storage from years ago. It took days. Hours staring at screen after screen of mundane files. Then I found it. A folder labeled Early IP Docs inside, not the official filings, but draft agreements, emails with his initial patent lawyer, a different one from his current corporate firm, and scan notes. And there it was. A communication referring to a crucial initial filing that was incomplete, a corner cut, a detail overlooked, or perhaps intentionally bypassed for speed, that potentially left a window open. Not a fatal flaw on its own, perhaps, but a weakness. And then another document, a draft partnership agreement from even earlier, mentioning contributors who were never listed in the final corporate structure, but who might have had a claim on the intellectual property if things hadn't been handled perfectly. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was something. It was a vulnerability in the seemingly impenetrable fortress of his success. It was the tiny crack in the armor. It was the shift. My focus narrowed. It wasn't just about surviving the debt anymore. It was about finding the leverage, about understanding the foundation he built his empire on and whether it could withstand scrutiny. The fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp determination. He thought he had left me with nothing but ruin. He forgot I had helped build the damn thing. I knew where some of the bodies were buried. And maybe, just maybe, one of them was still twitching. I showed the documents to my lawyer. Her initial skepticism turned to cautious interest, then focused intensity. This is interesting, she murmured, poring over the old scans. If there was a flaw in the original IP filing, or if these early contributors have a legitimate claim that was never properly settled, it could devalue the company significantly. Or worse, create a massive legal problem for him. It was a long shot, a complicated legal argument, but it was a chance. It was the only chance I had. We shifted tactics. The focus of our legal strategy changed from just fighting the debt and the asset division to launching a deep dive into the origins of his company's intellectual property and corporate structure. We hired a forensic accountant, a quiet woman with piercing eyes who could follow a money trail like a bloodhound. We subpoenaed old records, sought depositions from former employees mentioned in the early documents. It was expensive, a gamble, but there was a fierce, cold energy driving me now. Despair had been replaced by a quiet rage, a simmering determination. I wouldn't just roll over. I wouldn't let him get away with it. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about proving that his elaborate scheme to destroy me would not succeed. Every piece of evidence we uncovered, every inconsistency, every buried detail, felt like a small victory. The forensic accountant found transfers, large, undocumented sums moved from his business accounts into various shell corporations and private accounts over the past few years, coinciding with the time he was quietly maxing out my credit cards. It wasn't just random debt. It was a deliberate strategy. He was siphoning off assets, hiding money, while simultaneously creating debt in my name to reduce the value of the marital estate on paper, leaving me with the liabilities and him with the hidden cash and the seemingly debt-free company. It was a masterclass in financial manipulation, breathtaking in its cruelty and complexity. He was planning to claim the company was offset by debt, leaving me with nothing but the credit card bills he'd run up. But he hadn't covered his tracks perfectly. The early IP documents, the hidden transfers, the testimonies from former colleagues who knew about the initial, messier stages of the company, it all began to build a different picture. A picture of a man who had built his empire not just on innovation, but on questionable legal footing and active deception. The turning point wasn't a single dramatic moment, but a slow, steady hardening of my resolve. There was no turning back. I would see this through no matter the cost. I was no longer fighting for survival. I was fighting for retribution. The courtroom doors swung open, admitting the last few stragglers. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind you feel in a storm just before the thunder breaks. We were here. The final hearing. Months of grueling legal battles, financial investigations, emotional turmoil, all culminating in this single day. My lawyer looked calm, focused. I felt a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration. This was where it ended. One way or another. He walked in then, flanked by his legal team, his face a mask of practiced confidence. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. His posture, the slight, arrogant tilt of his head, spoke volumes. He thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought he had already buried me. The proceedings began. His lawyers presented their case, smooth, polished, presenting the narrative he had so carefully constructed. The company's immense value, the marital debt, the debt he created, framed as my spending, the complex financial situation, and the necessity of his proposed settlement, which, conveniently, left him with the company and me with the debt and a pittance. They spoke of his vision, his genius, his hard work. They painted him as the engine of wealth creation and me as a drain. It was sickening. I sat there listening, a knot tightening in my stomach, but underneath it, a core of ice. Let them talk. Let them present their flawless facade. My lawyer rose for our turn. Her voice was steady, clear. She didn't dwell on the emotional betrayal, though the undertones were undeniable. She focused on the facts. She presented the evidence we had meticulously gathered, the old documents challenging the integrity of the core patents, the testimony raising questions about early contributors and their potential claims, the forensic accountant's detailed report outlining the hidden transfers, tracing the flow of millions from the company through shell corporations to private accounts, perfectly timed with the maxing out of my credit cards. She explained his strategy, not just divorce, but financial ruin, using my credit as a weapon and a shield, intending to claim the debt offset the assets, leaving the company untouched and me annihilated. She argued that his actions weren't just marital misconduct, they were fraudulent, a deliberate attempt to devalue the marital estate and defraud me of my rightful share, potentially even exposing the company to future legal challenges from those early, unacknowledged parties if the IP was contested. She argued that given the egregious nature of his financial manipulation, the deliberate creation of massive debt in my name to benefit himself and protect his assets, and the potential legal vulnerabilities he had created within his own company through his early corners cutting and later siphoning, valuing my loss and his liability in this context was complex. And then she delivered the core of our argument, the thing we had built towards, that the only equitable distribution, the only way to account for his calculated fraud, the debt he loaded onto me, the assets he hid, and the precarious position he had potentially placed the company in, was to award me the asset he had tried so hard to protect, the source of his power, the very company itself, as the comprehensive settlement, covering all claims, liabilities, and his fraudulent conduct. A clean sweep. All of it. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. I dared a glance at him. His confident mask had cracked. His eyes were wide, fixed on my lawyer, then on the judge. The color was draining from his face. His lawyers were whispering frantically to him, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. They hadn't seen this coming. They had been so focused on fighting the debt and minimizing a cash settlement that they hadn't anticipated the argument that his own actions had jeopardized the company's foundation and made it the most appropriate form of restitution for his fraud. The judge listened intently, her kind eyes now sharp, assessing the evidence, the arguments, the man across the aisle whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. The deliberation felt like an eternity. The silence was broken only by the muffled sounds of the city outside and the frantic scratching of the court reporter's keys. My hands were clasped so tightly my knuckles were white. Then, the judge looked up. She cleared her throat again. Having reviewed the evidence presented, she began, her voice calm and measured, including the documented financial transactions, the evidence regarding the origination and handling of the company's intellectual property, and the clear pattern of behavior designed to obscure assets and burden one party with fraudulent debt. She paused, looking directly at him. The court finds the husband's conduct to be a deliberate and fraudulent attempt to manipulate the marital estate and deprive the petitioner of her rightful share, she continued, detailing the specific findings, the hidden transfers, the questionable IP. Therefore, she stated, her voice gaining firmness, in light of the respondent's actions, the court deems it just and equitable to award the petitioner 100% of the ownership of company name as a complete and final settlement of all marital assets, liabilities, and claims. The words hung in the air, heavy, definitive. 100%. Not a portion. Not a settlement amount. The entire company. The company he had built. The source of his identity, his pride, his power. Awarded to me. Because he had tried to use my financial ruin as his shield. Because he had been too greedy, too arrogant, too confident in his own manipulation. Because he had forgotten that the ground he stood on wasn't as stable as he thought, and that I knew where the cracks were. I heard a sound then. A sharp, choked gasp. I looked across the aisle. He was clutching his chest, his face ashen, eyes bulging. His lawyers were scrambling to catch him as he slumped sideways in his chair, collapsing in a heap of expensive fabric and shattered hubris. The bailiff moved forward. The courtroom erupted in a controlled chaos of gasps and concerned whispers. He had won everything, he thought. And in the end, by trying to take everything from me, he had lost it all. Leaving the courtroom felt surreal. The world outside hadn't stopped. Cars still honked, people hurried along the sidewalks, oblivious to the earthquake that had just occurred within those quiet walls. The crisp autumn air felt sharp against my skin. I wasn't just free of the crushing debt. I was now the owner of a multi-million-dollar company I never wanted. There was no triumphant surge of joy, only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. A cold sense of justice served, yes, but intertwined with the lingering ache of betrayal and the daunting reality of what came next. He was taken away in an ambulance, I heard later. A suspected heart attack, brought on by the shock. I didn't visit. I didn't feel pity. Just emptiness. The victory was absolute, undeniable. He had sought to beggar me, and instead, his greed and cruelty had paved the way for me to inherit the very empire he tried to protect from me. But it was a victory born from ashes, not built on joy. The aftermath wasn't a simple happy ending. It was complicated. Owning a company I knew little about, navigating the complexities of the business world he had inhabited, dealing with employees who had only ever known him as their leader. It was overwhelming. There were still messes to untangle, legal loose ends, the residue of his deceit. But there was also a quiet satisfaction. I had survived. More than survived. I had been pushed to the brink, faced complete annihilation, and found the strength, the cold resolve, to fight back intelligently, to use his own weapons against him. The debt was gone, legally discharged as part of the settlement. The financial noose was cut. I had my life back, albeit a drastically different one than I had ever imagined. Slowly, cautiously, I began to learn about the company, relying on the key employees who stayed, hiring people I could trust. It was a new kind of challenge, but it was a challenge I faced on my own terms, beholden to no one. The scars remained, deep and invisible. The ability to trust was damaged, perhaps permanently. The memory of his betrayal, the coldness of his calculation, was a constant reminder of the darkness that could hide beneath a charming surface. But the fear was gone. He had tried to break me, to leave me powerless. Instead, he had inadvertently handed me the reins to his kingdom. It wasn't the future I planned, but it was my future now. Hard one, bought with pain and resilience. A testament to the fact that even when you think you've lost everything, you might still have the quiet strength, the hidden knowledge, to turn the tables on the ones who tried to bury you. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear a version in the comments. And thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.